When we talk about the most evil race in history, many come to mind. The Dwemer, the Slode, Dunmer, maybe even the Orcs. And at first, I really thought it was the Dwemer. But recently I was reminded that there is one race that stands above all others in terms of pure, calculated cruelty and evil: the Ayleids. These wild elves were not just conquerors or tyrants. They were something far worse. They built an entire culture around suffering, torture, and the worship of the darkest forces in all of Tamriel. Their legacy is so dark that even today, thousands of years after their fall, the very mention of their name brings fear to scholars who study them. What made the Ayleids so uniquely evil was not just what they did, but how they did it. They turned cruelty into an art form. They made suffering into a religious practice. They took the darkest impulses of mortals and made them the foundation of their entire society. To understand why the Ayleids are the most evil race in Elder Scrolls lore, we need to look at how they built their empire on the backs of slaves, how they turned torture into entertainment, and how they made deals with the most evil beings in existence to maintain their power. The Ayleids ruled Cyrodiil for over 1,000 years, and during that time they created a system of oppression so complete and so brutal that it makes other forms of slavery look mild by comparison. They did not just want workers, they wanted victims. They did not just want servants, they wanted playthings. The enslavement of humans and beast folk by the Ayleids was not some accident of history or the result of economic necessity. It was a deliberate choice made by a race that viewed all other living beings as inferior creatures who existed solely for their pleasure and convenience. When the Ayleids first arrived in Cyrodiil, they found the land populated by various tribes of Nidic humans who had lived there for generations. These people had their own culture, their own traditions, their own way of life. They were free people who farmed the land, built their own settlements, and governed themselves according to their own customs. But the Ayleids saw them as nothing more than raw material for their twisted experiments. The conquest of the Nidic tribes was not a military campaign fought between equals. It was a hunting expedition where the Ayleids used their superior magic and organization to capture and enslave entire populations. They did not want to rule over these people as subjects or vassals. They wanted to own them completely, body and soul. The Ayleids developed magical techniques specifically designed to break the will of their captives and turn them into obedient slaves. They used mind magic to erase memories of freedom and independence. They used illusion spells to make their slaves believe that servitude was their natural state. They used fear and pain to condition their victims to obey without question. The initial enslavement was just the beginning. Over the centuries, the Ayleid slave system grew and evolved into something truly monstrous. They created systems to ensure a steady supply of slaves. Human families were broken up and scattered across different Ayleid settlements so that parents and children could never organize resistance. Women were forced to bear children who would be taken away at birth and raised as slaves from the very beginning of their lives. These slave-born humans never knew freedom and were easier to control because they had no memory of any other way of life. The Ayleids marked their slaves with magical brands that could never be removed. These brands did more than just identify ownership. They caused constant pain and could be activated by the slave masters to deliver punishment from a distance. A slave who tried to run away or disobey orders would be struck with agony so intense that they would collapse and writhe on the ground until their master chose to stop the torture. The brands also prevented slaves from using magic of their own, cutting them off from any hope of fighting back with supernatural power. The working conditions for Ayleid slaves were designed to maximize suffering while keeping the victims alive long enough to be useful. Slaves were forced to work from dawn to dusk with minimal food and water. They slept in cramped underground chambers that were more like dungeons than living quarters. They were given rags to wear that provided no protection from the weather or the sharp tools they were forced to use. Medical care was provided only when necessary to keep the slaves functional, and even then, it was done in the most painful way possible. The Ayleids took pleasure in watching their slaves suffer from diseases and injuries that could have been easily treated. But the enslavement of humans was not enough for the Ayleids. They also captured and enslaved beast folk like Argonians and Khajiit whenever they could get their hands on them. Argonian slaves were particularly prized because their natural resistance to disease made them useful for working in the dangerous magical laboratories where Ayleid sorcerers conducted their experiments. The reptilian people were forced to handle toxic substances and unstable magical energies that would have killed human slaves instantly. Many Argonians died from exposure to these dangerous materials, but the Ayleids considered this acceptable because they viewed lizard people as even less valuable than humans. Khajiit slaves were used primarily for entertainment. The cat people were forced to fight each other in gladiatorial contests for the amusement of their Ayleid masters. These were not honorable duels between warriors. They were desperate struggles where starving and injured Khajiit were forced to kill each other with crude weapons while Ayleid nobles placed bets on the outcome. The losers were often fed to Daedric creatures summoned specifically for the purpose of devouring them alive. Even some orcs were enslaved by the Ayleids, despite their reputation as fierce warriors. Orcish slaves were used for the most dangerous construction projects, like building the towers and bridges that connected Ayleid cities across Cyrodiil. The green-skinned people were forced to work at tremendous heights with no safety equipment, and falls were common. The Ayleids found it amusing to watch orc slaves plummet to their deaths and would often deliberately weaken the structures they were working on just to see them collapse. The scale of Ayleid slavery was truly massive. Every major Ayleid city had thousands of slaves working in its fields, mines, and workshops. The White Gold Tower itself was built almost entirely by slave labor, with hundreds of thousands of people dying during its construction. The Ayleids kept detailed records of their slave populations, tracking births, deaths, and productivity with the same care that a farmer might use to manage livestock. They classified their slaves into different categories based on their intended use and moved them around the empire, like commodities to be bought and sold. The slave markets of the major Ayleid cities were bustling centers of commerce where human beings were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Families were separated without a second thought, as parents were sold to one master while their children went to another. The Ayleids had no concept of the emotional bonds between slaves and treated any attempt to maintain family connections as a form of rebellion that needed to be crushed. Young children were often the most valuable slaves because they could be trained from an early age to serve their masters without question. Ayleid nobles would compete to acquire the youngest and most attractive children, not just for their labor, but for more sinister purposes. The sexual abuse of slaves was common and accepted throughout Ayleid society. Both male and female slaves were used for the gratification of their masters, and any children born from these encounters became the property of the slave owner. The psychological damage inflicted on the slave populations was immense. Generations of people grew up knowing nothing but servitude and abuse. They were taught that they were inferior beings who deserved their fate. They were forbidden from learning to read or write, prevented from practicing their own religions, and punished severely for speaking their native languages. The Ayleids wanted to erase every trace of human and beast folk culture and replace it with absolute obedience to their elven masters. But even the horror of systematic slavery was just the foundation for something much worse. The Ayleids did not content themselves with simply using their slaves for labor. They wanted to find new and creative ways to make them suffer. This led to the development of what they called art tortures, elaborate methods of causing pain and suffering that they treated like entertainment and culture. The art tortures were not random acts of cruelty carried out by sadistic individuals. They were carefully planned and executed spectacles that were central to Ayleid society. Every major city had specialized facilities designed specifically for torturing slaves in front of audiences. These torture chambers were decorated with elaborate carvings and magical lighting to create an atmosphere of refined culture, while the most heinous acts imaginable were carried out on the victims. The most famous of the art tortures were the flesh sculptures, where Ayleid torturers would use a combination of magic and surgical tools to reshape the bodies of living slaves into grotesque works of art. The process could take days or even weeks to complete, with the victims kept alive and conscious through the entire ordeal. The finished sculptures would then be displayed in the homes and palaces of wealthy Ayleids like expensive artwork. Some of these flesh sculptures were designed to move and make sounds, creating living decorations that would writhe and moan for the entertainment of guests. Another notorious form of art torture practiced by the Ayleids were the wailing wheels of Vindicel. These were large mechanical devices that resembled water wheels, but instead of being powered by flowing water, they were turned by the struggles of slaves who were bound to the spokes. The victims would be attached to the wheel in positions that caused them to experience different types of pain as the wheel rotated. Some would have their limbs stretched to the breaking point, others would be partially submerged in pools of acid or boiling water, and still others would be subjected to magical energies that caused intense agony without visible injury. The wheels were designed to rotate slowly, taking hours to complete a single revolution, so that the victims would experience a constantly changing variety of torments. The Ayleids of Vindicel would gather in comfortable viewing areas around the wailing wheels to listen to the sounds produced by the suffering slaves. They considered the screams, moans, and pleas for mercy to be a form of music, and they would often hold competitions to see who could create the most beautiful combinations of agony. Different types of victims were chosen for their vocal qualities, with children prized for their high-pitched screams and elderly slaves valued for their deep, mournful groans. The wailing wheels operated continuously, with fresh victims being added as others died from their torments. The process of attaching a new slave to the wheel was itself a form of entertainment, as the Ayleids would take their time securing the bonds and explaining to the victim exactly what they were about to experience. The anticipation and terror of the slaves was considered just as valuable as their actual suffering, and the Ayleids would often keep victims waiting for days or weeks before finally placing them on the wheels. The sounds produced by the wailing wheels could be heard throughout the city of Vindicel, serving as a constant reminder to all slaves of what awaited them if they disobeyed their masters. The Ayleids installed magical amplification devices to ensure that the screams carried as far as possible, and they would open the windows of their buildings during wheel sessions so that the entire population could enjoy the music of suffering. Visitors from other Ayleid cities would travel great distances to experience the unique acoustic properties of the Vindicel wailing wheels. Perhaps even more disturbing were the gut gardens of Cercin, where Ayleid torturers would remove the internal organs of living slaves and arrange them into elaborate decorative displays. The victims would be kept alive through magical means, while their intestines, lungs, hearts, and other organs were carefully extracted and positioned to create artistic patterns. The gardens were designed to be beautiful as well as horrifying, with colorful organs arranged like flowers and blood channels, carved into decorative patterns like irrigation systems. The finished gardens were tended like any other decorative landscape, with fresh victims being added as older displays decayed. The Ayleids of Cercin took great pride in their gut gardens and would host elaborate parties where guests could stroll through the displays while enjoying food and drink. The contrast between the refined culture of the hosts and the absolute horror of the decorations was intentional, designed to demonstrate the complete power that the Ayleids held over their victims. Servants would provide detailed explanations of how each display was created and would point out particularly clever or artistic arrangements of organs. The victims in the gut gardens remained conscious for as long as possible, their eyes following the movements of the Ayleid guests who admired their mutilated bodies. Some gardens included speaking devices that allowed the victims to beg for mercy or death, but these pleas were treated as part of the artistic experience rather than genuine requests for compassion. The Ayleids found it particularly amusing when victims tried to bargain for their lives or offered to serve their captors in exchange for a quick death. But perhaps the most shocking of all the Ayleid art tortures was the practice they called tiger sport, where children were set on fire and allowed to run around while their bodies burned. This was not execution or punishment, but pure entertainment. Ayleid nobles would gather in special arenas to watch human children as young as 5 or 6 years old being doused with alchemical substances that would ignite their clothing and hair. The children would then be released into an enclosed area where spectators could watch them run around in panic and agony until they collapsed and died. The Ayleids treated these events like sporting competitions, placing bets on how long each child would survive and awarding prizes for the most entertaining deaths. They would cheer and applaud when a child's screams reached a particularly high pitch or when the flames created interesting visual effects. Some arenas had special obstacles and hazards that the burning children would encounter as they ran, adding additional elements of suffering to the spectacle. The children used for tiger sport were often the offspring of slaves who had tried to rebel or escape. The Ayleids found it particularly satisfying to force parents to watch their children burn alive as punishment for their disobedience. The psychological torture of the parents was considered just as important as the physical suffering of the children, and skilled torturers would time the events to maximize the emotional impact on the watching slaves. The practice of tiger sport became so popular among the Ayleids that they developed different types of incendiary substances that would burn at different rates and temperatures, allowing them to create variations in the spectacle and ensure that no two tiger sport events were exactly alike. These art tortures were not isolated incidents carried out by a few mad individuals. They were cultural institutions that were celebrated and promoted throughout Ayleid society. Parents would bring their own children to watch the displays as a form of education and entertainment. Young Ayleids would compete to see who could create the most elaborate and cruel spectacles. The ability to cause creative suffering was seen as a mark of sophistication and culture, and those who excelled at torture were among the most respected members of their communities. The Ayleids also developed a complex aesthetic philosophy around their torture practices. They wrote treatises on the artistic merit of different types of suffering and established criteria for judging the quality of torture displays. Some Ayleid philosophers argued that the creation of beautiful agony was the highest form of art because it combined technical skill, creativity, and absolute power over another living being. They believed that the screams of their victims were more beautiful than any music, and that the sight of creatively arranged suffering was more moving than any sculpture or painting. To maintain their system of cruelty, and to gain the power needed to enforce their dominion over the slave populations, the Ayleids made extensive deals with the Daedric princes. Unlike other elven cultures like the Altmer, who strictly forbade Daedra worship, the Ayleids embraced it completely and made it central to their civilization. They did not just worship one or two Daedric princes, but actively sought out relationships with multiple princes, including some of the most evil and destructive ones in existence. The relationship between the Ayleids and the Daedric princes was not simply religious in nature. It was a business arrangement where both sides gained something valuable. The Ayleids offered up their slaves as sacrifices, entertainment, and raw material for the prince's various projects. In exchange, the Daedric princes provided the Ayleids with magical power, supernatural weapons, and armies of lesser Daedra to help them maintain control over their empire. This partnership allowed the Ayleids to become far more powerful and dangerous than they could have been on their own. Molag Bal, the Daedric prince of domination and corruption, was one of the most important patrons of the Ayleid Empire. The Ayleids built massive temples dedicated to him throughout Cyrodiil, where thousands of slaves were sacrificed in elaborate rituals designed to please the Prince of Rage. These ceremonies involved not just the killing of victims, but their complete degradation and corruption before death. Slaves would be subjected to every form of abuse imaginable, while Ayleid priests chanted prayers to Molag Bal and offered up the suffering as a form of worship. The temples of Molag Bal were some of the most horrifying places in the Ayleid Empire. They were designed to break the spirits of anyone who entered them, with architecture that was deliberately unsettling and magical effects that caused feelings of despair and hopelessness. The walls were decorated with the bones and preserved remains of sacrifice victims, arranged in patterns that told the story of their suffering. Living slaves were chained to the walls as permanent decorations, kept alive through magic, but subjected to constant torture that served as both entertainment for visitors and ongoing offerings to the prince. The priests of Molag Bal were among the most feared individuals in Ayleid society. They had the authority to claim any slave for use in their rituals, and they would often select victims based on their personal preferences rather than any religious requirements. These priests developed increasingly elaborate and cruel ceremony formats, competing with each other to create rituals that would gain more favor from their Daedric patron. They kept detailed records of their sacrificial practices and would study the reactions of their victims to determine which methods of torture and death were most pleasing to Molag Bal. Meridia, despite being considered one of the less evil Daedric princes by some, also received extensive worship from the Ayleids. They built great towers dedicated to her throughout their empire, using slave labor to construct monuments that reached toward the sky. But the Ayleid interpretation of Meridia's domain over light and energy led them to develop particularly cruel practices involving the manipulation of life force and magical energy within living beings. They would drain the life energy from slaves to power their magical workings, leaving the victims as empty husks that remained technically alive but completely devoid of will or personality. The temples of Meridia were filled with these empty slaves, who served as living batteries for Ayleid magical experiments. The process of draining life energy was slow and painful, taking weeks or months to complete. The victims would gradually lose their memories, emotions, and eventually their ability to think or feel, but they remained conscious throughout the entire process. The Ayleids found this transformation fascinating and would often invite guests to observe the gradual degradation of their victims. They considered it a form of purification, claiming that they were removing the crude mortal elements from their slaves and leaving behind pure energy that could be used for higher purposes. Namira, the Daedric prince of decay and revulsion, also received significant attention from Ayleid worshippers. They established underground temples dedicated to her in the sewers and catacombs beneath their cities, where they would conduct rituals involving the deliberate infection and corruption of living slaves. These ceremonies were designed to explore the boundaries between life and death, using magical diseases and parasites to transform victims into living examples of decay and corruption. The slaves used in Namira's rituals would be infected with magical plagues that would cause their bodies to rot and decay while keeping them alive and conscious. They would grow fungal infections that would sprout from their skin like grotesque flowers. Their flesh would become home to magical parasites that would eat them from the inside while reproducing and spreading to other victims. The temples of Namira were filled with the sounds of suffering as hundreds of infected slaves experienced the slow corruption of their bodies. The Ayleids, who served Namira, took great pleasure in studying the various stages of magical decay and would keep detailed notes on how different diseases and parasites affected their victims. They developed increasingly virulent strains of magical corruption and would test them on fresh slaves to see what new forms of suffering they could create. Some of these diseases were so potent that they would spread beyond the temples and infect the general slave population, causing epidemics of supernatural plague that would kill thousands of people. But the Ayleids viewed these outbreaks as successful experiments rather than disasters, and they would often deliberately release their diseases into slave quarters to observe how they spread and evolved. The worship of multiple Daedric princes created a complex religious hierarchy within Ayleid society. Different cities and regions specialized in serving different princes, leading to a variety of local customs and practices that were all united by their common focus on causing suffering. Ayleid nobles would travel between different temples to participate in various types of rituals, treating the worship of evil as a form of cultural exchange and entertainment. The priests of different princes would sometimes collaborate on large-scale ceremonies that combined elements from multiple Daedric traditions. The Ayleids also summoned lesser Daedra to serve as enforcers and guards throughout their empire. Clanfear, Scamps, Atronachs, and other Daedric creatures were a common sight in Ayleid cities, where they would patrol the slave quarters and hunt down anyone who tried to escape or rebel. These creatures were often more cruel than their Ayleid masters, taking sadistic pleasure in tormenting the human and beastfolk populations. The presence of these supernatural enforcers made resistance almost impossible, as slaves knew that even if they could overcome their mortal captors, they would still have to face creatures from the plains of oblivion. The summoning of Daedra required massive amounts of magical energy, which the Ayleids obtained by draining the life force from their slaves. Large-scale summoning rituals would consume hundreds or even thousands of victims, whose life energy would be used to tear open portals to oblivion and call forth armies of Daedric creatures. These rituals were spectacular events that would be attended by Ayleid nobles from across the empire, who would gather to witness the mass sacrifice of slaves and the arrival of their supernatural allies. The White Gold Tower served as the primary focus for these large-scale Daedric rituals. The tower was built specifically to channel and amplify magical energies, and its design incorporated elements that were pleasing to multiple Daedric princes. The upper levels of the tower were dedicated to different princes, with each floor containing specialized chambers for conducting specific types of rituals. The basement levels were used for storing victims who were awaiting sacrifice, with thousands of slaves held in cramped cells until their turn came to be offered up to the Daedra. The influence of Daedric worship on Ayleid culture went far beyond their religious practices. It affected every aspect of their society, from their art and architecture to their legal system and social customs. The Ayleids began to see themselves as chosen servants of the Daedric princes, destined to rule over all other races and to spread the influence of oblivion throughout Tamriel. This belief justified their cruelty in their own minds and made them even more willing to commit atrocities in service of their dark patrons. The partnership between the Ayleids and the Daedric princes was so successful that it attracted the attention of other supernatural entities who wanted to participate in the arrangement. Vampire lords, necromancers, and other dark creatures flocked to the Ayleid Empire, where they were welcomed as allies and given access to fresh victims for their own twisted purposes. The Empire became a magnet for every form of evil and corruption in Tamriel, creating a concentration of darkness that had never been seen before or since. However, even within this evil empire, there were those who began to question the wisdom of complete dedication to the Daedric princes. Some Ayleids, particularly those in the older and more traditional cities, maintained worship of the Aedra alongside their service to the Daedra. These Ayleids, known as the Barsibic faction, believed that a balance between light and dark was necessary for the continued prosperity of their civilization. They were concerned that the increasing influence of the Daedric princes was making Ayleid society too unstable and violent, even by their own standards. The tension between the traditional Barsabic Ayleids and the radical Daedrophiles who wanted to worship only the Daedric princes eventually erupted into a civil war known as the Narfinsel Schism. This conflict began in the year 198 of the First Era and lasted for several decades, dividing the Ayleid Empire and weakening it significantly. The war was fought not just with conventional weapons and magic, but with competing Daedric and Aedric influences that turned the conflict into a supernatural catastrophe. The Daedrophiles, led by powerful sorcerer kings who had made direct pacts with multiple Daedric princes, eventually gained the upper hand in the civil war. They had access to more powerful magic and more ruthless tactics, and they were willing to sacrifice unlimited numbers of slaves to fuel their war effort. The Barsabic Ayleids, despite their own considerable magical abilities, could not match the raw destructive power that their enemies drew from the plains of oblivion. The final defeat of the Barsabic faction came in an event known as the Scouring of Vendelbeck, where the Daedrophiles used massed Daedric summoning to overwhelm the last stronghold of the Traditionalists. Thousands of lesser Daedra were unleashed upon the city, slaughtering not just the defending soldiers, but also the civilian population and even the slaves who had no part in the conflict. The survivors of the Barsabic faction were either killed or driven into exile, leaving the Daedrophiles as the undisputed rulers of the Ayleid Empire. With the moderating influence of the Aedra worshippers removed, Ayleid society became even more decadent and cruel than it had been before. The Daedrophiles were no longer constrained by any competing religious or cultural influences, and they gave themselves over completely to the worship of the darkest forces in existence. They began holding massive festivals, where thousands of slaves would be tortured to death in elaborate ceremonies designed to please their Daedric masters. The suffering of their victims became a form of prayer, and the more creative and prolonged the torture, the more favor they believed they would receive from the princes. The period following the Narfinsel Schism saw the development of new and even more horrifying forms of art torture. With unlimited access to Daedric magic and no internal opposition to their practices, the Ayleids created spectacles of suffering that surpassed anything they had done before. They built enormous amphitheaters where thousands of spectators could watch mass torture events. They developed new magical techniques for keeping victims alive and conscious through unimaginable levels of pain. They created hybrid creatures by magically fusing slaves with Daedric entities, producing abominations that were neither fully mortal nor fully Daedric, but combined the worst aspects of both. The Daedrophile victory also led to changes in how the Ayleids governed their empire. The old system of city-states ruled by individual sorcerer kings was replaced by a more centralized structure where power flowed from the most devoted servants of the Daedric princes. Religious authority became more important than traditional nobility, and those who could demonstrate the greatest cruelty and devotion to evil were elevated to positions of leadership. This created a system where advancement required increasingly extreme acts of brutality, leading to a spiral of escalating violence that affected every level of Ayleid society. The defeat of the Barsabic faction also eliminated the lost voices of restraint within Ayleid culture. Even the traditionalists had been cruel and evil by any reasonable standard, but they had at least maintained some limits on the worst excesses of their society. With them gone, there was no one left to argue for moderation or to suggest that perhaps some practices were too extreme even for the Ayleids. The empire became a pure expression of absolute evil, where the only limit on cruelty was the imagination of the torturers and the physical endurance of their victims. The changes brought about by the Narfinsel schism also affected the relationship between the Ayleids and their subjects. The slave populations had always been treated as less than human, but after the Civil War they were increasingly seen as nothing more than raw material for religious ceremonies and entertainment. The idea that slaves might have any rights or deserve any consideration was completely abandoned, and even basic practical concerns about maintaining a healthy workforce were ignored in favor of spectacular displays of cruelty. But the very extremism that made the Daedrophile Ayleids so powerful also contained the seeds of their destruction. By removing all restraints on their behavior and giving themselves over completely to evil, they created a system that was unsustainable in the long term. Their cruelty became so extreme and so widespread that it sparked a massive slave rebellion that would ultimately destroy their entire civilization. The human and beastfolk populations of Cyrodiil had endured centuries of oppression and torture, but the escalating brutality of the post-schism period finally pushed them beyond their breaking point. The Alessian slave rebellion that began in the year 242 of the First Era was not just a political uprising or an economic protest. It was a desperate struggle for survival by people who knew that if they did not overthrow their oppressors, they would eventually be tortured to death in the art torture chambers or sacrificed on Daedric altars. The rebellion was sparked by the actions of a Nedic woman named Alessia, who had witnessed firsthand the horrors of Ayleid rule and could no longer stand by while her people suffered. Alessia had been born into slavery and had spent her entire life watching friends and family members disappear into the torture chambers and ritual sites of her Ayleid masters. She had seen children burned alive for entertainment, had watched elderly relatives slowly tortured to death in flesh sculpture sessions, had witnessed countless acts of cruelty that would have been unthinkable in any civilized society. But the event that finally drove her to action was witnessing a mass sacrifice at a Daedric temple where hundreds of human children were offered up to Molag Bal in a single ceremony. The sight of innocent children being tortured to death while Ayleid nobles watched and cheered was more than Alessia could bear. She realized that there was no hope of reform or negotiation with the Ayleids. Their entire civilization was built on cruelty and suffering, and they would never voluntarily give up their system of oppression. The only choice was rebellion, even if it meant certain death for most of those who participated. Alessia began secretly organizing resistance groups among the slave populations, spreading word of her plans through hidden networks that had developed over the centuries of oppression. The rebellion was not spontaneous or unorganized. It was the result of careful planning and coordination by people who knew that they would only get one chance to strike at their oppressors. They spent years stockpiling weapons, identifying targets, and preparing for the moment when they would rise up against their masters. The slaves faced enormous challenges in organizing their rebellion. They were constantly watched by Ayleid overseers and Daedric guards who would torture or kill anyone suspected of plotting resistance. They had no access to weapons or armor, no military training, and no experience in organized warfare. They were outnumbered by their enemies and faced opponents who had access to powerful magic and supernatural allies. By all reasonable calculations, the rebellion should have been quickly crushed and its leaders executed in the most painful ways possible. But the slaves had several advantages that their Ayleid masters had not anticipated. First, they had nothing left to lose. After centuries of torture and oppression, death in battle seemed preferable to continued slavery. This gave them a level of desperation and determination that their enemies could not match. Second, they had the support of the divine powers who opposed the Daedric princes. The Aedra had been watching the growing evil of the Ayleid Empire with increasing concern, and they were finally ready to intervene directly to stop the spread of corruption. When Alessia prayed to Akatosh for help in her struggle against the Ayleids, the dragon god of time answered her prayers by sending her a champion named Pelinal Whitestrake. Pelinal was not an ordinary mortal warrior, but a supernatural being specifically created to destroy the enemies of humanity. He possessed strength and speed that far exceeded human limitations, and he was armed with magical weapons that could cut through Ayleid defenses like paper. Pelinal's arrival marked the beginning of the end for the Ayleid Empire. He was a force of divine vengeance unleashed upon a civilization that had become so evil that even the normally distant Aedra could no longer ignore their crimes. Pelinal fought with a fury that matched the centuries of anger and hatred that had built up among the enslaved populations. He did not just kill Ayleid soldiers and nobles. He hunted them down like animals, seeking out every individual who had participated in the torture and oppression of innocent people. The stories of Pelinal's battles against the Ayleids describe scenes of incredible violence and destruction. He would attack Ayleid cities single-handedly, cutting through their magical defenses and slaughtering their inhabitants without mercy. His rage was so intense that he sometimes lost control and attacked anyone with elven features, including allies who were trying to help the rebellion. This berserker fury made him both incredibly effective and terrifyingly unpredictable, but it also demonstrated the depth of righteous anger that the Ayleid crimes had provoked. The rebellion quickly spread throughout Cyrodiil, as word of Pelinal's victories reached other slave populations. Entire cities rose up against their Ayleid masters, with slaves turning on their tormentors and destroying the instruments of their oppression. The art-tortured chambers were torn apart by mobs of freed slaves who had suffered in them for years. The Daedric temples were burned to the ground, and their priests were killed in ways that mirrored the cruelties they had inflicted on others. The Ayleids found themselves facing enemies who had learned to match their own brutality. The war was long and bloody, lasting for over a year as the rebels fought to destroy every trace of Ayleid power in Cyrodiil. The Ayleids did not surrender easily. They summoned massive armies of Daedra to fight alongside them, turning entire regions into battlefields where mortals and supernatural creatures clashed in desperate combat. They used their most powerful magic to create weapons of mass destruction, unleashing plagues and curses that killed thousands of rebels. They threatened to torture captured slaves to death if the rebellion did not end, but by this point the rebels knew that surrender would only mean a return to the torture chambers and sacrifice altars. The Ayleids also tried to play different factions of rebels against each other, offering freedom to some slaves in exchange for betraying others. But the shared experience of oppression had created bonds between the various enslaved peoples that could not be broken by Ayleid manipulation. Humans, Argonians, Khajiit, and even some orcs who had escaped from slavery fought together against their common enemy, united by their hatred of the system that had brutalized them all. The final battle of the rebellion took place at the White Gold Tower itself, the heart of Ayleid power and the center of their empire. Pelinal Whitestrake fought his way to the top of the tower, cutting through waves of Ayleid defenders and their Daedric allies. The battle was so intense that it could be seen from miles away, with magical energies lighting up the sky above the Imperial City as divine and infernal powers clashed in mortal combat. At the pinnacle of the tower, Pelinal faced Umaril, the Unfeathered, one of the most powerful Ayleid sorcerer kings, and a being who had made so many pacts with Daedric princes that he was more supernatural entity than mortal elf. Umaril commanded armies of Daedra and possessed magical abilities that could reshape reality itself, but even his power could not stand against the divine wrath that Pelinal represented. The duel between Pelinal and Umaril lasted for hours, with both combatants drawing upon powers that mortals could barely comprehend. When Pelinal finally killed Umaril, the death of the Sorcerer King sent shockwaves throughout the Ayleid Empire. The magical bonds that held their civilization together began to unravel, and their Daedric allies started to abandon them as it became clear that their mortal servants were doomed. The fall of the White Gold Tower marked the end of Ayleid rule in Cyrodiil, but the rebellion did not end there. The freed slaves continued to hunt down every remaining Ayleid throughout the province, determined to ensure that their former masters could never rebuild their system of oppression. Small groups of Ayleids tried to hide in remote ruins or flee to other provinces, but they were tracked down and killed by bands of former slaves who had not forgotten the centuries of torture and cruelty they had endured. The destruction of the Ayleid Empire was so complete that within a generation, very few of the wild elves remained alive in Cyrodiil. Those who survived were scattered and powerless, reduced to hiding in ancient ruins and practicing their dark arts in secret. The great cities that had once housed thousands of Ayleid nobles and millions of slaves were left empty and crumbling, their torture chambers and Daedric temples abandoned to decay and ruin. The rebellion had not just defeated the Ayleids militarily, it had completely destroyed their civilization and erased their way of life from the face of Tamriel. But even after their empire fell, individual Ayleids continued to practice their cruel ways wherever they could find victims. Some retreated to hidden underground complexes where they kept small numbers of captured slaves for their personal use. Others fled to distant provinces, where they tried to establish new bases of power, bringing their knowledge of torture and Daedric summoning to regions that had never experienced such concentrated evil. A few even managed to achieve a form of immortality through their pacts with Daedric princes, becoming undead creatures that continued to hunt for victims centuries after their mortal bodies should have died. These surviving Ayleids remained dangerous threats long after the fall of their empire. They would emerge from their hiding places to kidnap travelers, raid small settlements, or corrupt local populations with their knowledge of dark magic. The techniques they had developed for torture and Daedric summoning were passed down through hidden cults and secret societies, ensuring that their evil influence would continue to spread even without a central organization to coordinate it. Some of the most dangerous artifacts and spellbooks from the Ayleid Empire ended up in the hands of necromancers, cultists, and other dark practitioners who used them to continue the Ayleid tradition of causing suffering for supernatural power. The memory of Ayleid cruelty lived on in human culture for thousands of years after their empire fell. Parents would tell their children stories about the horrors of Ayleid rule to remind them why they must never allow such a system to return. The ruins of Ayleid cities became places of fear and superstition, avoided by travelers who knew the evil history of those stones. Even today, thousands of years later, the mention of the Ayleids brings up memories of the darkest period in human history, when an entire race was systematically tortured and brutalized by their elven overlords. The legacy of the Ayleids extends far beyond their historical impact on Cyrodiil. They represent a warning about what can happen when a civilization abandons all moral restraints and gives itself over completely to evil. They show us that intelligence, culture, and magical power are not enough to make a people good or admirable. Without basic compassion and respect for the rights of others, even the most advanced society can become a nightmare of oppression and cruelty. The Ayleids had every advantage that a civilization could want. They had powerful magic, sophisticated technology, beautiful cities, and centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture. but they used all of these gifts only to become more effective at causing suffering. They turned their intelligence toward developing new methods of torture. They used their magic to keep victims alive during prolonged agony. They built their cities as monuments to cruelty and oppression. They accumulated knowledge only to find better ways to break the spirits of their slaves. What makes the Ayleids particularly disturbing is that their evil was not the result of desperation, ignorance, or external pressure. They chose to be cruel because they enjoyed cruelty. They chose to worship Daedric princes because they wanted to become more powerful and more effective at causing harm. They chose to enslave other races because they believed they had the right to treat other living beings as objects for their amusement. Every step down the path toward absolute evil was a deliberate choice made by people who understood the consequences of their actions. The Ayleids also demonstrate how evil can become self-perpetuating and escalating. What started as simple conquest and enslavement gradually evolved into systematic torture and mass sacrifice. Each generation of Ayleids grew up thinking that the cruelties they witnessed were normal and acceptable, and they felt pressure to surpass their predecessors in terms of creative brutality. The art tortures became more elaborate and horrifying over time, as each new group of torturers tried to impress their peers and please their Daedric patrons. The system created incentives for increasing cruelty and provided no mechanisms for restraint or moderation. Even within the context of the Elder Scrolls universe, where evil is common and powerful, the Ayleids stand out as uniquely horrible. The Dwemer were arrogant and dangerous, but they were primarily focused on their own research and experiments rather than on causing suffering for its own sake. The various human empires, throughout history, have committed atrocities, but they have usually been driven by political or economic motivations rather than pure sadism. Even most Daedric cults are focused on gaining power or favor from their patrons rather than on torture as an end in itself. The Ayleids created an entire civilization where causing pain and suffering was the primary cultural value. They made cruelty into an art form, torture into entertainment, and the systematic oppression of other races into a religious duty. They built their entire identity around the idea that they were superior beings who had the right to treat everyone else as disposable objects. This combination of racial supremacy, religious fanaticism, and sadistic pleasure in causing harm created a perfect storm of evil that has never been matched by any other group in Elder Scrolls lore. Other evil factions in the Elder Scrolls have committed terrible crimes, but they have usually had some redeeming qualities or understandable motivations. The Ayleids had neither. They were not defending their homeland from invaders or struggling to survive in a hostile world. They were not driven by desperation or misguided beliefs about the greater good. They were simply evil for the sake of being evil, and they built their entire civilization around that principle. Even their religious practices were focused on pleasing supernatural entities that represented the worst aspects of existence. While other cultures might worship Daedric princes for protection or power, the Ayleids worshipped them specifically because they wanted to become better at causing harm. They saw the Daedric princes as role models and tried to emulate their cruelty and callousness in their own dealings with mortals. The fact that the Ayleids were eventually defeated and destroyed does not diminish the horror of what they accomplished during their reign. For over 1,000 years, they maintained a system of oppression and torture that affected millions of people. Countless generations of humans and beastfolk lived and died in slavery, never knowing freedom or kindness. The psychological and cultural damage they inflicted on the populations they enslaved lasted for centuries after their empire fell, and some of their victims never fully recovered from the trauma they experienced. The techniques and knowledge they developed for causing suffering continued to influence dark magic practitioners long after the last Ayleid city fell. Their innovations in torture and Daedric summoning became part of the standard toolkit for necromancers, cultists, and other practitioners of forbidden magic throughout Tamriel. Some of the most dangerous spells and artifacts in Elder Scrolls lore can be traced back to Ayleid research into methods of causing pain and binding supernatural entities to mortal will. The Ayleids also left behind a physical legacy in the form of their ruined cities and hidden complexes. These locations remained dangerous thousands of years after their builders died, filled with magical traps, undead guardians, and artifacts that can corrupt or kill anyone who disturbs them. Many of these ruins still contain evidence of the atrocities that were committed within their walls, serving as permanent reminders of the depths of cruelty that the Ayleids achieved. Perhaps most importantly, the Ayleids serve as a historical lesson about the importance of resisting evil before it becomes too powerful to stop. The human and beast folk populations of Cyrodiil endured centuries of oppression before finally finding the courage and means to rebel against their tormentors. If they had acted sooner, or if other nations had intervened to stop the Ayleid system of slavery and torture, millions of lives could have been saved and untold suffering could have been prevented. The story of the Ayleids reminds us that evil does not appear fully formed overnight. It grows gradually, becoming more extreme and more entrenched over time. The Ayleid Empire started with simple conquest and evolved into something far more horrible through a process of gradual escalation that took centuries to reach its ultimate form. At each step along the way, there were opportunities for intervention or reform that were missed or ignored, allowing the system to become more powerful and more difficult to challenge. The fall of the Ayleids also demonstrates that even the most entrenched and powerful systems of oppression can be overthrown if enough people are willing to fight against them. The slaves who rebelled against the Ayleids faced overwhelming odds and almost certain death, but their courage and determination eventually triumphed over their oppressors. Their victory shows that no system of evil, no matter how well established or how powerful, is permanent or unbeatable if good people are willing to stand up and fight against it. In the vast tapestry of Elder Scrolls lore, with all its complex moral questions and nuanced characters, the Ayleids represent something approaching absolute evil. They were not anti-heroes with understandable motivations or tragic figures driven to desperate acts by circumstances beyond their control. They were monsters who chose to embrace the darkest aspects of existence and build their entire civilization around the principle that causing suffering was not just acceptable but desirable. They turned cruelty into culture, torture into entertainment, and the systematic oppression of other races into a form of worship. They made pacts with the most evil beings in existence and used their power to create spectacles of suffering that have never been equaled in their scope or creativity. They maintained their system of horror for over 1,000 years, affecting millions of lives and leaving scars that lasted for generations after their fall. There is no way to justify what the Ayleids did. There is no hidden virtue or noble purpose that makes their actions understandable or forgivable. They were evil in the purest and most complete sense of the word, and they deserve to be remembered as the most horrible race in Elder Scrolls lore. Their story serves as a warning about what happens when people abandon all moral restraints and give themselves over completely to the worship of power and cruelty. It reminds us that civilization and culture mean nothing without basic decency and compassion, and that the greatest advances in knowledge and magic are worthless if they are used only to cause harm. The Ayleids had every advantage that a people could possess, but they used all of their gifts to become the most effective monsters in the history of Tamriel. For that, they deserve to be remembered not as a great civilization that fell to misfortune, but as a cautionary tale about the depths of evil that mortals can reach when they choose to embrace darkness rather than light.